I'm starting the recording now. Okay, so I was saying that a paper soon to be published will cast light on some aspects of Antoine's presentation today. And you can also, if you're interested in his account of health, there is an early paper he co-wrote with Anne-Marie Gagné-Julien, which was published, I think, in 2015 on homeostasis and the concept of health. Which was already an original paper, and so yeah, that's part of his works. But you can have a look on his webpage if you want to know more. Antoine, thank you again, and it's up to you now.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks to all for being here, and thanks again to Maëlle Lemoine and Thomas Prater for having me here today. I'm honored to be invited to speak at your seminar. The goal of my presentation today is to motivate and sketch an account of health and pathology that is, on the one hand, functionalist, by which I mean that defines health and pathology in terms of function and dysfunction and not in terms of welfare, harm, and prudential values, or more ethical notions. But on the other hand, that is holistic, that sets the criterion of functionality at the level of whole organisms rather than at the level of their parts. So this holistic aspect distinguishes the account I'm going to propose for the predominant functionalist accounts of health and pathology that have been proposed, in that those accounts set the criterion of functionality at the level of the parts of individual organisms. And here I'm thinking of, in particular, of Boorse's account, but also Wakefield account focuses on part function and dysfunction. So here's the outline of my presentation. I'm going to start by making 3 preliminary remarks. Then I'm going to spend some time motivating the holistic functionalistic account of health and pathology that I want to defend. Then I'm going to give a sketch of what this account I think should look like. And I will end with some remarks about how what I'm proposing can be situated with respect to Boorse's concept of illness, which he distinguishes from the concept of pathology, and also with respect to Werkhoven's recently proposed dispositional account of health and pathology. But just before I proceed, I just want to make sure, do you see my slides?
Yes, we do, no problem.
Okay, all right. Okay, so first, 3 preliminary remarks. A first remark is on method. In the recent decades, philosophers of medicine have become increasingly self-conscious about the method that they adopt, and have started to think about what method should be adopted when trying to give accounts of health and pathology. Classically, philosophers of medicine have used an approach that is called conceptual analysis. Boorse has focused on conceptual analysis of a scientific concept. Wakefield has included lay people in the linguistic community whose concept he seeks to analyze. And more recently, alternatives have been proposed. Schwartz has proposed philosophical explication as the appropriate approach for developing accounts of health and pathology. And Maëlle Lemoine has argued that philosophers of medicine should instead try to naturalize the concepts of health and pathology and related concepts. So here the approach I'm going to adopt is the philosophical explication approach. So I became convinced by Schwartz and Lemoine's arguments that conceptual analysis is not very promising as an approach to the inquiry in the concepts of health and pathology. It's been philosophers have been applying it for a long time, and it seems that it's now running in circles. The reason why I'm adopting a method of philosophical explication instead of naturalization is that here what I'm looking for is a general concept of health and pathology. I think naturalization is very powerful and interesting with respect to particular types of pathologies, but it seems to me that at least there's something that can be reached through philosophical explications if the goal is to provide an account of health and pathology in general. So very broadly, what philosophical explication does is first you look for a definition. What you do is you look for a definition that best fulfills theoretical, and here I would add practical roles that the health and pathology concepts are meant to fulfill, and then you assess the various accounts that are proposed on the basis of how they fulfill those theoretical and practical roles. Here I'm adding practical. Schwartz focuses on theoretical roles for this concept. I think the practical role of the concepts of health and pathology are also relevant. Second remark on naturalism, the divide between naturalism and normativism, which is classical in the philosophy of medicine. Today, by defending a functionalist account of health and pathology, I purport to achieve only one part of the naturalistic project in philosophy of medicine. So functionalism is more classically located in the naturalistic camp in philosophy of medicine. But what I'm interested here is to defend functionalism as opposed to welfareism about health and pathology. And by that, I mean that I want to defend an account of health and pathology in terms of function and dysfunction, as opposed to accounts in terms of prudential ethical notions of well-being and harm. And why I emphasize this is, the reason why I emphasize this is that I want to leave it open whether a functionalist account would be fully naturalistic or whether it would be value-laden. I think that Kingma has a very strong arguments supporting the idea that in final analysis, the function and dysfunction concepts that are relevant for philosophy of medicine are value-laden concepts. I'm not fully convinced, I'm still unsure, but I think she has very strong argument. There's a recent response by Werkhoven that has been published, which is also convincing. I want to leave that open today. I'm happy today if I convince you that a satisfactory account of health and pathology has to be defined in terms of function and dysfunction concepts, and not in terms of notions of well-being and harm. So I leave open the value-free, value-ladenness question today. A third remark is that I somewhat have a hidden agenda that motivates me to look for such a holistic, functionalistic account of health and pathology. Mel said a little in his introduction about my interests in philosophy of ecology and environmental ethics. And what triggered me initially to look for a more holistic, functionalistic account of health and pathology is another project that I pursued, which is at the intersection of philosophy of ecology and environmental ethics. This project is focused on ecologists sometimes use of the concept of ecosystem health, which applies at the level of ecosystems, which it proposes to apply at the level of ecosystems, the concept of health that is common in human and non-human organism medicine. So why this pushes me towards a holistic account of health and pathology is because in the case of ecosystem, there's clearly a decoupling of the health of the parts from the health. There's clearly a decoupling of the health of the whole from the health of the parts. If one wanted to apply a functionalist account of health and pathology that defines health in terms of function and dysfunction at the level of the parts, this wouldn't work in ecosystems because it seems to be a generally recognized phenomenon that a healthy ecosystem will contain parts, meaning here organisms within those ecosystems that are in pathological states. Here's the title of a paper from 2009, Fungi and Diseases, Natural Components of Healthy Forests. And here's a quote for a textbook on forest health. A healthy forest can have many unhealthy trees, just as an unhealthy forest can have healthy trees. So if the health of ecosystems was defined by the health, was supposed to be defined by the health of their component, then all ecosystems would be unhealthy. That's not the kind of concept of health that is applicable to ecosystems. So that's a background motivation for me to look for a more holistic concept of health and pathology. I wanted to mention it because it's good for you to know that I somewhat have a hidden agenda, but here today I'm going to stop from now on talking about ecosystems and try to motivate the holistic account I'm looking for on the basis of considerations that are internal to the project of providing an account of health and pathology that applies to individual organisms. I also wanted to mention it because I know that in Bordeaux at your research center, many people are interested in the microbiome and human beings as holobionts, which is sometimes viewed as an idea that what we used to call individual organisms are in fact ecosystems. So perhaps there are connections that can be drawn between accounts of ecosystem health that will be relevant for ecology and accounts of health which will be relevant for the health of so-called individual organisms. So now let's turn to the motivation I will give to the holistic functionalistic account of health and pathology that I want to articulate. So I mentioned previously that the method I want to adopt is the method of philosophical explication. So what do you do when you want to provide a philosophical explication? The first step is to delineate theoretical and practical roles for the concepts that you're interested in, here the health and pathology concepts, and then you evaluate the various accounts that have been proposed, that are proposed on the basis of how well they fulfill those theoretical and practical roles. And here I must say that I think that philosophical explication is not that far from conceptual analysis as an approach to the study of concepts. Conceptual analysis focuses on intuitions about particular cases. It focuses on whether an account gives you a good way to embrace the intuitive extension that you think a concept should have. I think that this, as I said earlier, I think this runs in circle because there are many cases that will be about which intuitions will hopelessly fluctuate from one philosopher to another, and anyone can bite the bullet when it's convenient to do so. But I think intuitions are still relevant to philosophical explication when one is in the process of identifying theoretical and practical roles for the concepts. And here I think those are intuitions not about the extension of concepts, but about the intention of concept, what the concept should achieve. Why do we want to have concepts of health and pathology? Why is it interesting? And what should those concepts be able to achieve if they're to be relevant for the practice and the theory of medicine? So my first step in motivating the holistic functionalistic account I want to defend today is first identify what I think are three desiderata for the health and pathology concepts. And here I'm not saying that the list is exhaustive, but I think there's at least those three desiderata that has to be fulfilled by satisfactory concepts of health and pathology. Those desiderata, as you will see, arise in a large respect from debates in philosophy of medicine. And second step, I'll evaluate Boorse's and Wakefield's account on the basis of those three desiderata, and support mine also on the basis of those three desiderata. So desideratum one. It seems that one important thing that concepts of health and a concept of pathology should be able to do is to distinguish pathologies from other unfortunate conditions. It seems that this is one of the important reasons why we want to have such concepts. Ugliness, poverty, being stupid, being in a bad marriage are harmful or unfortunate conditions, but they're not pathologies. And it seems that the concepts of health and pathology are meant to tell us, among unfortunate conditions, which ones should be put in a special category, the category of conditions that are pathological. Functionalist accounts with respect to this desideratum fare quite well. standard functionalist line is to say, well, there's a pathology only when there's a dysfunction. It's part of the definition of a pathology that a dysfunction is required, and the presence or absence of a dysfunction will make the difference between unfortunate conditions that count as pathologies and unfortunate conditions that do not. And here, what's at stake at a more practical level is the ability of the concepts of health and pathology to guide our judgments about what is over-medicalization, where, in contrast to what is not over-medicalization, or draw a line, even a blurry one perhaps, between therapy and amelioration. So I think that those are goals associated to the concepts of health and pathology, that those concepts, that satisfactory accounts of those concepts should enable them to fulfill. Second desideratum, satisfactory accounts of health and pathology should reflect the idea that on a general basis, pathologies are unfortunate conditions. So there's somewhat a tension between desideratum 1 and desideratum 2, because on the one hand, desideratum 1 tells us that a satisfactory account should tell us that not all unfortunate or harmful conditions are pathology, but on the other hand, a satisfactory account should also imply that most pathologies are unfortunate conditions. And here, welfarist accounts of health and pathology fare well. A common welfarist line is to say that there's a pathology only when there's a harm, and by saying this, one makes harm by definition a requirement for pathology, and therefore all pathologies by definition will be unfortunate conditions, and therefore desideratum 2 will be met. And this desideratum has been sometimes overlooked by naturalists in the philosophy of medicine. For instance, Boorse does not seem to ascribe much relevance to this desideratum, but I think that it's important, and that it's probably the most important Achilles heel of naturalistic or functionalistic accounts of health and pathology. And what's at stake here, as Lewins and Kingma have pointed out, is the relevance of our concepts of pathology. By overlooking this desideratum, naturalists like Boorse, or naturalism in general, fails, as Kingma says, fails to capture the shared feature of diseases that make them and have historically made them salient to us as a category. These are conditions that are bad for us and that are grouped together for that reason. Naturalists strip diseases of the precise feature that make us care about what diseases are. So I think that this desideratum should not be overlooked, and that a naturalist or functionalist account of health and pathology should be able to meet this desideratum. And desideratum 3, a satisfactory account of health and pathology should be able to distinguish cases where an organism fares badly because it has a pathology from cases where the organism just finds itself in a hostile environment. It's the inability of the organism to fare well in the environment is not caused by a pathology on the part of the organism, but it's caused by the fact that the organism is located in an environment that's not appropriate for it. And this desideratum is a little less common in discussions in the philosophy of medicine, but it recently arose from discussions of the relationship between health and environment, issues highlighted by Kingma, discussed by Hussman and Garson and Piccinini. And I think in those discussions, a contrast that arises as important is the ability of concepts of health and pathology to distinguishes two kinds of functional inabilities that can characterize organisms, illustrated by here a contrast about two different situations in which an organism can be unable to distribute oxygen within its body. The inability to distribute oxygen when one is submerged in water is not pathological. It's just that organisms, just like human beings, are not supposed to be able to breathe in water, and therefore to distribute oxygen within their body when submerged in water. Whereas the inability of someone to distribute oxygen when one's chest was crushed in a stampede, in this case, it seems that the problem is intrinsic to the individual organism that's unable to distribute oxygen. And it seems to me that a satisfactory account of health and a satisfactory account of pathology should be able to account for this distinction. A common line to meet this desideratum is to relativize the health and pathology concepts to notions of evolutionary design and or normality within a reference class. And I'll say more about this a little later in my presentation, because this is a line I will adopt in the account I will propose. So now that we have those three desideratum on the table, let's look again at Boorse's and Wakefield's accounts of health and pathology and see how they stand with respect to those desiderata. So first observation is that their accounts fare quite well with respect to desideratum 1 and desideratum 3. This is not much of an issue. Their account, by linking pathology to dysfunction, draw a line between unfortunate conditions that are and are not pathologies, and they have ways to distinguish cases where an organism fares badly because it has an intrinsic problem versus cases where it's just put in an inappropriate environment. The issue will be about desideratum 2, which I mentioned, is the one with respect to which functionalist or naturalistic accounts of pathology fare less well. Boorse's account of pathology fares badly with respect to desideratum 2, reflecting the usual practical negative value of pathology. And this is made salient by Nordenfeld's and Wakefield's criticism of the BST, but also, I shall argue, by Boorse's response to this criticism. Nordenfeld and Wakefield raised their criticism in the context of a method of conceptual analysis. Boorse responds within this concept, and ultimately, as we will see, he responds by biting the bullet. But I think that from a philosophical explication perspective, we can say why Boorse's response makes things even worse for him. So what's at issue here is a key aspect of Boorse's BST. The idea that part dysfunction is sufficient for pathology. This is a central aspect of Boorse's account. If you have one part that is subnormally functioning, then you, by definition, have a pathology for Boorse. And Nordenfeld, as is well known, objected this by saying, then this implies that someone with only one malfunctioning cell would have a pathology. That person would have one part that has a part dysfunction, and therefore, by definition, according to Boorse, this person would be in a pathological state. Wakefield lists other cases in a more recent paper, asymptomatic disease carriers, like the example of typhoid Mary, asymptomatic HIV infections, benign mutations. And for Wakefield, this implication would be counterintuitive because we all carry 100 to 200 new mutations in our DNA. Fortunately, most of these are harmless and have no apparent effect on our health. So for Wakefield, an account that would imply that as soon as you have one benign mutation or one malfunctioning cell, you're in a pathological state would be counterintuitive. It would fail to capture the right extension of the health and pathology concepts. So now let's look at Boorse's response, which essentially consists in biting the bullet. Boorse just says, well, that's fine. Everyone is pathological. To the pathologist, a part dysfunction is sufficient for pathology, and therefore no one is normal. At the pathologist level of description, there is no paradox in calling one dead cell pathological, and he adds some specification, except of course in tissues like skin, mucosa, whose normal function entails constant death and regeneration. But in other cases, it's fine to say that as soon as one has a malfunctioning cell, one should count as pathological. And to somewhat explain away the seeming counterintuitiveness of this move, Boorse appeals to a contrast between what he calls a theoretical concept of normality and a clinical concept of normality. And he says, well, what I'm after is an analysis of the theoretical concept of normality. Theoretical non-health is defined in terms of part dysfunction, and that this does not have much relevance for assessments of patient at the clinical level. Doesn't matter, because those are two distinct concepts. To call, as he says, to call a condition pathological implies nothing about its importance. Think otherwise is to confuse theoretical and clinical normality. Judgments of importance belong to clinical practice, not to basic theory of normality. So according to Boorse, the reason why some people intuitively think that it is wrong to assert that having just one part dysfunction is sufficient for being pathological is because when people reason about this, they're thinking about theoretical normality is somewhat infected by their thinking, their views about clinical normality. But a clean analysis of the theoretical concept of normality should lead one to the conclusion that having just one part dysfunction is sufficient for pathology. The problem with Boorse's response. So here, of course, between Boorse and Wakefield, it seems that the debate can go on forever. Boorse bites the bullet. Wakefield says, oh, this is so counterintuitive, you cannot make that move. And it seems that there's no independent way to settle this if we adopt a conceptual analysis approach focused on the extension of the concepts of pathology. But if we adopt a philosophical explication approach, then I think we can highlight a problem with Boorse's response that comes back to the desideratum 2 I identified, the ability for a satisfactory concept of health and a satisfactory concept of pathology to reflect the idea that on a general basis, pathological conditions are conditions that it is bad to have. Even if we grant Boorse the need for a concept of theoretical health that is distinct for the more practical concept of clinical health, I'm sympathetic with this. Wakefield rejects this. But even if we grant this idea to Boorse, the second desideratum I highlighted implies that the two concepts, extensions, should have significant overlap. If our concept of theoretical health includes too many cases that are outside of the scope of clinical abnormality, then our theoretical concept of pathology will fail to meet the second desideratum. It will, and we will end up with a concept of theoretical pathology that is so irrelevant that we just wonder whether it's really a concept that is interesting for our thinking about medicine. So otherwise, if the extensions do not significantly overlap, our pathology concept will fail to reflect the idea that on a general basis, pathologies are unfortunate conditions to have. And a quick note here, although intuitions about particular cases may be shifty, some people will have the intuition that it's fine to say that one part dysfunction is sufficient for being in a pathological state, and others will have the reverse intuition. So intuitions about particular cases, I think, will be shifty. But it seems to me that intuitions about what the health and pathology concept should achieve are more robust. It seems quite clear to me that satisfactory concepts of health and pathology should be able to meet desideratum 2. Now let's turn to Wakefield's harmful dysfunction account. Wakefield's account fares better with respect to desideratum 2, and how it does so is by making harm part of the definition of pathology or disorder in Wakefield's preferred terminology. A pathology for Wakefield is a harmful part dysfunction, and therefore, by definition, harm is necessary for pathology, and therefore, the class of pathologies is included in the class of unfortunate or harmful conditions. But one problem which I discuss in my paper forthcoming about which Maël said a few words earlier, is that this way of dealing with desideratum 2 makes Wakefield's HDA poorly applicable to non-sentient organisms, plants, fungi, many invertebrate animals. And it does so unless one adopts an account of harm in terms of dysfunction that blurs the line between the HDA's harm and dysfunction component. So there's a dilemma for Wakefield here. Either his account does not apply to non-sentient organisms, or his account adopts an account of welfare and harm in terms of function and dysfunction, and then indirectly dysfunction will become sufficient for pathology, which is precisely what Wakefield wants to adopt. So I think that although at first sight Wakefield's account fares better than Boorse's with respect to desideratum 2, it does so only in ways that in a way that raises further problems. So now let's turn to my alternative, the holistic functionalistic account of health and pathology. In the sketch of it, I want to present you today. So my proposal is to define health in terms of the normal functional ability of an organism as a whole, rather than the normal functional ability of its parts, as Boorse defends. My proposal is inspired for a distinction made by Ulrich Kroes in a paper, in a chapter on different norms that can be applied to the concepts of function. And Kroes draws a distinction between a notion of malfunction and a notion of dysfunction. He defines malfunction as a part's departure from its kind's normal range of functional performance. So Kroes' malfunction is equivalent to Boorse and Wakefield's notion of part dysfunction. And he defines dysfunction as a part's malfunction that impairs the functioning of the organism as a whole. So here I'm interested in the contrast between those two notions more than by the terminology Kroes adopts. It seems to me that the terminology could be flipped. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that there's two types of malfunctioning or dysfunctioning that are interesting. Malfunctioning at the level of the parts and malfunctioning or dysfunction at the level of an organism as a whole. And my proposal is that the health and pathology concept should be defined in relation to this notion of dysfunction, this holistic notion of dysfunction applied at the level of the organism as a whole. So again, my proposal to define health in terms of the normal functional ability of an organism as a whole. And of course, if I want to defend such an account, well, I owe you a further account of what this means, what this notion of normal functional ability of a whole organism amounts to. And I'm going to give a sketch of what this notion might look like in two steps. I think the first step will be to choose an appropriate account of function to do the job. If I want to defend health and pathology in terms of function and dysfunction, I have to say first what I mean by function and dysfunction. Philosophers of biology have proposed various accounts, so we have to choose which one will be the most useful for the job. And second, add some specifications to turn this concept of function into a concept of normal function or normal functioning, from which a notion of dysfunction applicable at the level of whole organisms can be derived. Step one, choosing the right account of function. The first step, the first thing that can be observed is that the most famous or most popular account of function in the philosophy of biology, the selected effects account of function, will not do. And the reason is that this account focuses on whole organisms in the sense that it focuses on organisms as levels of selection, but what it ascribes functions to is the parts and traits of those organisms and not the organisms as a whole. So the selected effects accounts yields functional norms for the parts and traits of individual organisms, but not for organisms as a whole, unless we want to define functioning at the level of the organism as a whole as just the sum of the functioning of their parts, which would bring us back to part functionalism and part dysfunction. the view that I want to avoid. So that means that we need an account from the broad category that is explored in philosophy of biology as an alternative to the selected effects account, the broad causal role or systemic family of concepts of functions. And here many different proposals have been put on the table. My choice goes to Boorse's account of function in terms of goal contribution, which is a little more restrictive than the Cummins accounts. And I think that my main reason for choosing this account is that the understanding of goal directedness that Boorse plugs in this account, goal directedness in terms of persistence through plasticity, gives us some way to accommodate the variation in functional performance that is observable in organisms. Normal functions is just not a matter of maintaining some functional ability, but it's also a matter of adapting the level of functional ability to the demands of the environment that an organism is facing. So normal functional performance is adaptive to the situation, and it also involves the possibility that sometimes some function is not being performed, even in a situation where its performance would be relevant, just because the homeostatic mechanisms that bring back the functional ability are in the process of achieving themselves, and the functional performance is in the process of being reestablished. So for instance, not being able to see just after moving from a well-lit to a darker room is not pathological, even if it's a relevant environment for seeing, because it just takes time. It just takes time for the homeostatic mechanisms in the organism to reestablish the functional performance. So in a nutshell, the goal contribution account will help with respect to desideratum 3, the relationship between health and environment that I mentioned earlier. So now that we've picked an account of function to do the job, the next step is to add specifications that will turn this concept of function into a concept of normal function that's useful to inform the concepts of health and pathology. And one of the specifications that must be added is to specify, okay, well, but what is the goal of an organism? We have to answer this question to tell, okay, but what are those states that the organism is supposed to maintain, to be able to maintain in order to count as in a healthy state? A first possibility, perhaps the most natural move here, which I will reject, is to identify survival and reproduction as the goal of the organism. Boorse, when he adopts the goal directedness account, the goal contribution account of function, says, well, the goal of an organism, the naturalistic goals of organisms are simply survival and reproduction. And if we adopted this idea, then one possibility would be to say that the normal functional ability of an organism, as a whole, is just its ability to survive and reproduce. This would be an account of health and pathology that Boorse has rejected. He has provided reasons against this account, so I'm not attributing this account of this proposal to Boorse. I'm just considering it as one possibility that one could derive from his assertion that the naturalistic goals of organisms are survival and reproduction. And I think that besides the reasons invoked by Boorse himself against such a proposal, such a proposal will not do because it would fail. It would fail with respect to desideratum 3. I mentioned earlier the example of not being able to distribute oxygen when submerged in water. It seems that whether this inability should count as pathological or not should depend on the kind of animal you are. Of course, if you're a human being, then you're not the kind of being that is supposed to be able to do this. Being submerged in water is not the standard environment of a human being. We're not adapted to be able to breathe in water and distribute oxygen in water. So if one is submerged in water and unable to breathe and eventually dies, it's not because that person previously had a pathology that determined this outcome is just because the person was put in an environment that is inappropriate for the kind of organism that it is. In contrast to this, in a fish, we're not able to distribute oxygen when submerged in water, then the fish would probably have to count as pathological. Fish live in water, they're supposed to be able to breathe in water and to distribute oxygen in water. And to consider another example, a whale is not able to breathe in water, but has other means by which it's able to stay in water in a long time and able to distribute oxygen in the water in the body when in water for a long time. So the fish in the whale would count as pathological if not able to distribute oxygen when submerged in water, but a human being should not. And it seems that in all three cases, the individual organisms are equally inadapted to the environment, equally unable to survive and reproduce, but only in the the second and the third cases, this inability signals a pathology on the part of the organism involved. So what then should we identify as the goal of the organism? Another strategy, which I think is the good one, is to inject a Commensian ingredient in the goal contribution theory of function that is adopted by Boorse to get rid of the idea that the goal of an individual organism is to maintain the ability to survive and reproduce as a generic capacity, and instead focus on particular capacities that an individual organism of a given type typically maintains, and that explain its ability to survive and reproduce in the environment it finds itself. I found this proposal in a paper by Forrest and Lebida. Here, the goal of an organism then would be a set of capacities typically maintained by organisms of its type. So a set of capacities that are normal in a reference class, and probably in line with Boorse's account, the relevant reference classes should be species, sex, and age. So my account here would be similar to Boorse's in this respect. It would be, in a sense, a holistic version of Boorse's account. And Forrest and Lebida give a very interesting suggestion as to one way to identify the capacities that will be relevant to the assessment of the health of an organism. Those will most frequently be capacities that are important for the typical interaction that organisms of a particular type has with its environment. So here there might be an issue of circularity, and I want to highlight this, and maybe we want to talk a little more about this in the Q&A. And why this circularity? Well, accounts that involve reference, that link health and pathology to reference classes seem to raise this kind of problem. This is part of Kingma's criticism of Boorse's account. And one reason why is that we know the normal capacities of a normal, we know what the normal capacities are by observing normal specimens in normal environments. So empirically, our investigations attempting to find what are the normal capacities for a given type of organisms will be underdetermined because when we see a specimen that fares badly in an environment, there's always a decision that has to be made between whether we count the organism as normal but in an unsuitable environment, and whether we count it as abnormal and in a suitable environment. And this decision involves some kind of circularity. I don't think that the circularity is vicious. It seems to me that in many fields of science, there's this kind of issue about decisions about what theory has to be adopted being underdetermined by our empirical data. But there's also the concerns raised by Kingma about circularity in the definition of reference classes. Those are serious. Werkhoven's response is quite convincing in my view, but in any case, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, I'm fine, at least for today, with the possibility that the account I'm proposing is ultimately value-laden, that values are involved when delineating reference classes with respect to which we compare organisms to assess their health condition. I'm happy today if I convince you that this value ladenness, if it's hopelessly present, as Kingma argues, is a value ladenness that is not concerned with concepts of welfare and those kinds of concepts that are relevant for ethics, but more related to functional assessments of biological entities. So to summarize my proposal, first, a definition of health. An organism, as in my proposal, is healthy if and only if it is disposed to homeostatically maintain or restore the capacities that are normal for its reference class. In pathology, an organism has a pathology if and only if it has lost a disposition to homeostatically maintain or restore one of the capacities that are normal for its reference class. Back to the three desiderata. So now what I want to do is to assess my proposal with respect to the three desiderata and see how it stands in comparison to Boorse and Wakefield's accounts in this respect. First, desideratum 1, distinguishing pathologies from other unfortunate conditions. My account provides a way to meet this desideratum. Yes, through the holistic dysfunction concept, only dysfunctions constituted by a holistic dysfunction should count as pathological. So it singles out a category of unfortunate conditions that are pathological conditions, and that is what is sufficient to meet the desideratum 1. Now, desideratum 2, the one that was raising most problems for Boorse, and also I argued for Wakefield, reflect the idea that on a general basis, pathologies are unfortunate conditions. And I think that, yes, the account I'm proposing does meet this desideratum, because it's expectable that most holistic dysfunction will be harmful to their carrier. As we saw earlier, it's not the case that most part dysfunctions count as harmful to their carrier. That's Wakefield's whole point against Boorse. But if we try to imagine cases of holistic dysfunctions that are not harmful to their carrier, we will find some cases, but they will be exceptions. And I think that this is what we need here. We don't necessarily need that all pathological conditions count as harmful to their carrier. What we need to meet desideratum 2 is that most pathological conditions are harmful to their carrier. And I think here, in fact, my account has a comparative advantage to Wakefield's because on Wakefield account, pathologies are harmful by definition, whereas in the account I'm proposing, pathologies are not made by definition harmful, which allows for the possibility that some holistic dysfunctions are harmless. For instance, sterility, if one does not want to reproduce, it seems to be harmless for that person, but it still should count as a pathological state because on my account, it involves a holistic dysfunction. And now this is the desideratum 3. Providing a way to distinguish cases where an organism fares badly because it has a pathology from cases where the organism just finds itself in a hostile environment. Yes, an organism, on my account, an organism that fares badly in an environment counts as pathological only when it fares badly because it lacks some adaptive capacities that organisms of its type normally have. If it fares badly because it lacks some capacities that organisms of its type do not normally have, then it's not pathological, it's just faring badly because it's put in an environment to which organisms of its type are not adapted. So now my fourth section, how does my proposal stand with respect on the one hand to Boorse's concept of illness, which Boorse talks about and which Boorse distinguishes from his concept of pathology, and also how my account stands with respect to Werkhoven's recently proposed dispositional account of health and pathology. So first, Boorse's concept of illness. Is my proposal equivalent to Boorse's concept of illness? So Boorse focuses on the concept of pathology, which, as I mentioned, is defined in terms of part dysfunction, but also says at some place in his writings that there's also a concept of illness that we want to talk about, and that is more holistic, that concerns the global situation of an organism. And he's not that precise in the way he defines this concept, because for him it's not an important theoretical concept. But there's still the question of whether I'm just shifting the topic from one concept to another that's already present in Boorse's account. So let's look a little closer at what Boorse says about this concept of pathology. In one of his publications, he says a patient is sick or ill when pathological processes rise to a systemic level that produces global incapacitation of the whole organism. So with this idea of global incapacitation of the whole organism, it seems that Boorse's concept of illness is quite equivalent to my account of pathology in terms of holistic dysfunction. But in another publication, Boorse also says blindness and paraplegia are not illnesses, whereas flu is. And the reason why he says this, it seems, is that blindness and paraplegia involve part dysfunctions that are localized in the organism that is affected, whereas flu involves has effects all over or at least at different places in the organism. So it's the idea that the dysfunctions are the incapacities are present at many places in the organism, and here his concept of illness is, I think, different from the concept of pathology in terms of holistic dysfunction that I proposed. So to summarize, Boorse's illness concept seems to combine, on the one hand, incapacitation of the whole organism, and on the other hand, effects widespread within the parts of the organism. And my pathology concepts adopts only the former criterion. So in this respect, it seems to me that what I'm proposing is not exactly equivalent to Boorse's concept of illness, but maybe Boorse has just not been so careful when talking about illness, because it's not a concept that he's committed to analyze precisely in his work. It's just something that he invokes in passing to deal with some objections that are pointed out against his theory. Another respect in which my proposal deviates from Boorse's concept of illness is that for me, the holistic concept is the one that occupies the central theoretical role, whereas for Boorse, the illness concept plays no important role. As I just said, it's just a concept he invokes to deal with some counterexamples that put his theory in trouble. Now, how similar is my proposal to Werkhoven's recent definition of health in terms of recent dispositional account of health and pathology? So Werkhoven, just like me, defines health in terms of capacities or disposition in his preferred terminology of organisms as a whole, defined in relation to reference classes. So just like what I propose, Werkhoven's account is somewhat a holistic version of Boorse's BST. The main difference between the account I'm proposing and Werkhoven's is that Werkhoven compares organisms' capacities to the maximal set of capacities of its reference class, whereas I compare an organism's capacities to the normal set of capacities of its reference class. In other words, Werkhoven abandons the idea of normality, whereas I retain it in my account. And of course, this raises ontological or metaphysical problems, or at least challenges for my account. I will have to say more at some point about how the normal functional capacities of reference classes are to be identified. But as I just said, I'm fine if the ultimate conclusion is that reference classes and those notions of normality are value-laden in final analysis. An advantage of my account that derives from the preservation of the idea of normality within it is that my account fares better with respect to desideratum 2. Werkhoven draws no line between the lack of capacities that do and do not concern health. Illiteracy is among the maximal capacities of the reference class to which human beings, ability being literate is among the maximal set of capacities realized by members of the human reference class, and therefore the lack of illiteracy would count as something relevant to the assessment of someone's health on Werkhoven's account. And Werkhoven's account also does not draw a line between lack of capacities that are pathological and lack of capacities that just make one less healthy than another member of his or her reference class, but that do not count as pathological. For instance, the lack of Olympic athletic abilities. It seems that, yes, if I lack those capacities, I'm less healthy than someone who has them, but I'm not pathological simply for this reason. So conclusion, I first identified 3 desiderata for concepts of health and pathology. First, desideratum, those concepts should be able to draw a distinction between pathologies and other unfortunate conditions. Second, desideratum, pathologies, those concepts, satisfactory accounts of those concepts should reflect the idea that pathologies are usually bad conditions to have, and satisfactory accounts should be able to draw a distinction between organisms having pathologies versus organisms that are fully normal but that are put in a hostile environment. On the grounds of those desiderata, I assessed Boorse's and Wakefield's account. I noted that Boorse fails with respect to desideratum 2, that Wakefield accommodates desideratum 2, but in a way that raises other problems for his account, the applicability of his account to non-sentient organisms. And I propose my own solution, define pathology as holistic dysfunction. An organism has a pathology if and only if it has lost the disposition to homeostatically maintain or restore one of the capacities that are normal for its reference class. Thank you very much.
So thank you.
Don't worry, Antoine, we're there.
I was starting to wonder.
Oh, sorry, the time for me just to find the button again and close the door, actually, to tell you the truth, because there was noise in the room in my house. Anyway, so thank you very much, Antoine. So questions, time for questions now. You can, I think, given that there's not too many of us, it's possible to have an oral chat, which is better than the written one. But if you want to ask a written question, it's also possible.
Should I stop sharing my screen at this stage?
Or maybe, yes. And if we need to see some slide, it will be easy for you to share it again.
Okay.
If you want to ask questions, but it's probably better that you raise your hand in the participant chat. But if you want to, I mean, I'm not sure I can see all of you if you raise your hand in front of the camera. Okay, so Jonathan.
Yes, hello, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Hi, so thank you very much for the talk, Antoine. It was really good. I had some kind of general questions. I mean, I think one of the interesting benefits of taking your approach is, I mean, amongst others, is trying to see how you might have an account that is not necessarily a hybrid account, but an account, I guess, that's maybe somewhat kind of in the naturalistic side that still incorporates these, important intuitions from normativism. And I think it's an interesting project to pursue. And I also think, I guess, the kind of going into the holistic approach, I think is probably a good idea. I do have some, I guess, concerns, as to how exactly to do that. So the first question, I suppose, is in the sense of why stick to the functionalism concept? I mean, why stick?
Well, I lost you. I think your microphone turned off.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I was muted there for a moment. Maybe I'm going too long. Yeah. So the first question, I guess, is yeah, why stick to the notion of function? I guess rather than looking at other kinds of accounts, I guess other notions like mechanism, for example, I guess, or other concepts within kind of the biological sciences that might be able to help flesh your account out. So I guess that's one. And the other one would be, how do we know when we are really achieving or describing a whole organism? I thought you were going to kind of flesh that out a little bit more in terms of the goals of the organ, but I have it in mind as well, because I'm thinking recently as well in biont and these kinds of an issue has to be able to delineate what is the whole organism.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this. On the first question, the question of function concepts and mechanisms, I think I'll just confess that I just naturally was moved from part function and dysfunction to function of the whole without thinking of possible alternatives, or maybe through thinking that if mechanisms are involved, since mechanisms and functions are notions that are connected, at least on some accounts of mechanisms, then the mechanism alternative would not be that much of a shift from an approach focused on functionality. But I'm looking for considering those other alternatives. I probably just did not run into them that much in my readings in the philosophy of medicine, and it's probably a dead end goal of my literature review, perhaps. On the second issue, how to delineate an organism, I think it's going to be an important question on the kind of account I'm proposing, especially because I emphasize desideratum 3, distinguishing cases where the problem is intrinsic to the organism versus where the organism has no intrinsic problem, but it is just put in an environment that is inappropriate to it. And I still have to think about this, but it seems to me, one idea I'm leaning towards is an idea of the individuality of the organism that would be based in ecological considerations, by which I mean the organism is moving in an environment, and what moves with the organism should count as part of the organism, whereas what does not move with the organism is part of its environment. So it means that for example, some microbes that move with us and participate in our functioning in a robust way because they move with us, then they're important for how we're able to adapt to the various environments in which we find ourselves, and therefore they should count as part of us in this respect. But it's just an intuition about a possible account. I have nothing more fleshed out about this for now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Antoine, for the answer. So we have two written questions in the chat. So the first one by Steven. Steven says first that he thinks that your ideas are actually fantastic, and is asking one question about homeostasis and how important, he says, and you can read it in the chat maybe, how important is homeostasis to your account? Is your account of functioning, I'm just reading here, such that it involves the maintenance of homeostasis? You also mentioned restoring capacities. So can you please give an example of these capacities and how they differ from homeostatic functions?
Okay. So homeostasis, I tend to interpret it very broadly as closely equivalent to the idea of persistence through plasticity associated with the Boorse-Nagel account of goal-directedness. So I would not see homeostasis as a capacity that's maintained, but more as the mode by which some capacities are maintained. So a capacity is maintained homeostatically if it's adjusting to the demands of the environment in real time through some plastic mechanisms of the kind involved in the persistence through plasticity account of goal directedness. For instance, the amount of oxygen in my blood, what is needed might depend from the situation, and the capacity to circulate the appropriate amount of oxygen in my blood will be homeostatically maintained in the respect that it varies in function of the needs of the situation.
Okay. Thank you. The next question you can see in the chat is a question about psychiatric illness. What would be in this case, I mean, if your account, I think that the question is, if your account applies to psychiatric illness, what kind of capacities would they apply to? And is there in general a place for what can be called a psychosocial or psychosocial capacities?
Thanks a lot for this question. I think I will just have to confess that I don't know what to say about psychological and health and illness. As I mentioned earlier, and as Maël mentioned, my work focuses more on philosophy of ecology and environmental ethics. Philosophy of medicine is part of what I'm doing, and I had the chance to look at health as applied to individual organisms as functional entities, functional material entities, but I would need to collaborate with someone to see the extent to which my account can apply to psychological health. So perhaps it does not, and we need two different accounts of health and pathology for physical health and mental health. I'm sorry to say I have nothing more to provide about psychological health.
Okay, thank you, Antoine. I think you're slightly too modest here, but I understand the concern. But in the previous paper, the one that is forthcoming, actually, you don't address directly the question of psychiatric disorders, but nevertheless, you discuss Wakefield's account, and it's for sure Wakefield says that his analysis is first. He intends in this analysis first to address psychiatric disorders, but he thinks that it is valid for other disorders, and you extend his account to much more than he had in mind in the first place, let's say. So I think that on the contrary, what you say is relevant also, at least to some extent, to mental disorders. But it's fair to say that in this presentation you just gave, it might need an extra elaboration. Yeah. Okay, so we have now a question by Sorin.
Yes, thank you. First of all, congratulations for this very analytical and clear presentation. I find very interesting your holistic approach. And now the question. What do you think about this kind of biological anomalies, like a snake with two heads or a dog with 5 legs? And because they pass your 2 criteria, they can reproduce, they have the capacity to survive, but do you think that they are pathological in your respect, under your definition? What do you think? And the second, well, the second is more a comment. Maybe you may use for your account Leibniz proposal, namely where he said that, you know, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So your holistic account, I think, should benefit from this, and it's just a comment. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. So that's a good opportunity to clarify maybe something that was ambiguous in my presentation. So I mentioned the possibility of defining health in terms of ability to survive and reproduce, but I rejected it precisely even though I did not mention the exact same examples as you gave, but exactly to exclude such weird cases from the class of healthy conditions. So on my account, being able to survive and reproduce is not the only thing that matters. More specifically, what matters is being able to maintain the capacities that are normal for your reference class, and those capacities being typically ones that are adaptive in the environment that organisms from your reference class find themselves. But it's not the same thing as saying that being able to survive and reproduce is sufficient for being in a healthy state. So thanks for this. I really want to dissociate myself from this kind of view. So if there was some ambiguity here, I think it's important that I clarified this. On the suggestion about Leibniz, I will look at Leibniz. I always find it fascinating to look at the history of philosophy, and especially the history of biology or philosophical biology, and what philosophers have said on those questions. So I will clearly look at it. And also I'm interested in what Leibniz has to say about an organism versus a pond, because there's an issue about what is an ecosystem in comparison to what is an organism here, if we think of the pond as an ecosystem. So yeah, thanks for the suggestion.
And thank you for the answer. There's a question by Christian Saboredo. Hi, by the way, Christian, that's...
Yeah, hi, Christian.
So I'm reading the question, maybe you see, you can see it in the chat, but I'm reading it for everyone. So he says, thank you very much for the talk. I have some difficulty seeing how your approach meets the first desideratum, understanding pathologies as something other than unfortunate conditions. For example, ugliness can easily be seen as a biological dysfunction, at least as far as my survival and reproductive capabilities are concerned. If we opt for a more organismic notion of dysfunction that interprets dysfunctions as biological failures with respect to the normal capacity of organisms, for instance, the ability to self-maintain, then what seems to be missing in your approach is a notion of biological function that clarifies what the goal of organisms is: self-maintenance, preservation of homeostasis.
Okay, thanks a lot, Christian, for the question. I'm just rereading some passages of it to make sure. Yeah, okay. So the case of ugliness, why ugliness should not count as a holistic biological dysfunction. In a sense, I agree that it will all boil down to what the normal capacities of a reference class are. So until an account of this is provided, and an account of what is to be included in the class of capacities that are relevant to health and what is excluded from this class, one will be able to raise those kinds of objections. So I think it's part of what should not be included in capacities that are relevant to health for a reference class is issues about ugliness and other unfortunate conditions that do not seem to be relevant for health. And just to clarify once again, survival and reproduction capabilities are not the only thing that matter on my account. If one is ugly and has less ability to survive and reproduce for this reason, since ugliness is not among the capacities that are relevant to health on the reference classes that the characterization of reference classes that I'm assuming at least, this poor ability to survive and reproduce would not be something that has any relation to health and pathology, at least all things being equal. In terms of what seems to be missing in your approach is a notion of biological function that clarifies the goal of the organism. Self-maintenance, preservation of homeostasis would be a clear goal. My issue here is that self-maintenance it seems means is not specified enough until you specify identity conditions with respect in relation to which some individual will be said to have maintained itself or not have maintained itself. It's just not, it seems that it's going back to self-maintenance as a characterization of what is sufficient for health would bring us back to health and pathology in terms of survival and reproduction, and I think we need more specification, and that's why I'm integrating reference classes in the account I'm proposing. I see more questions coming out, so maybe I stop here as to my response to Christian, and I hope Christian and I will have the chance to talk about this again.
I guess so, yes. We have a question by Simon now.
Yep, hello. Hi, Antoine, thank you for your talk. I have a question. So you know that in philosophy of medicine, a huge deal of the debate has been revolving around counterexamples, proposing a definition of health and pathology, and then someone else finds counterexamples and then says then this definition has to be rejected, and I then propose my own. What this sort of process? What do you think about this? Is this still applicable for your account, or what role would counterexamples in the traditional sense, as philosophers debated, what would this play for you?
So I tried to adopt an approach that does not give too much bearing on examples and counterexamples, and focus instead on roles that the concepts of health and pathology should achieve, as a way, precisely as a way to settle cases where, well, your intuition is stronger than mine, and we'll run in circles like this for a long time, and we won't settle anything. So at least on principle, I would not want to give too much bearing to counterexamples. But maybe if someone comes up with one counterexample, then I will be corrupted back to the conceptual analysis approach. But that's something I would want to avoid, at least at the methodological level.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, both for the question and the answer. You have a question in the chat, new question in the chat. Short question to ask, actually, but maybe a longer answer. To what extent can your theory be transposed in medical practice and in medical education?
In medical practice, I think the relevance of the health and pathology concepts are mostly relevant at the level of drawing lines between, even perhaps blurry lines between what is therapy and what is amelioration. If we're not interested in drawing that kind of line, I'm not sure why we would still need concepts of health and pathology. So I think that's probably the most practically important aspect of those concepts, because in medical practice, even if some condition is not a pathology, if it's a condition that one does not want to be in, there might be good reasons to try to change this condition. So I would think that's to medical practice, that's what gives the concept most of its relevance. To medical education, I will have to ask myself the question. I haven't thought of it yet. I guess I would suspect that it's relevant for medical education to think at least a little about what health and pathology should mean in the practice of medicine in the context of the societies we're in. But I would have to think more about it to have something more specific to say.
And actually, there's just a small follow-up on this question. And she says also, she asks also, in the line of approaching a patient that was related to the first aspect, not medical education, but medical practice. So in the one-to-one encounter in the clinics, let's say, do you see any because your answer was, I think it's the intention of the follow-up question. Your response was quite general. Which is fair, but so does it mean that it should not have, or you don't see any application in daily life, let's say?
Well, I would think that it depends on how important for an individual patient it is to know whether the condition that he or she dislikes is a pathology or not. I would suspect that many people would care. They would be interested in knowing whether their situation is normal or abnormal. So in this respect, I think for how people think about their own conditions, this would be relevant. But if I guess someone shows up and says, I don't mind at all about whether I'm healthy or not. The only thing I care about is I don't like the situation I'm in. Please change it. Then I guess for in relation to such a person, the concept of health and pathology would not matter that much.
Okay, thank you. That's a clear answer. Okay, yeah, Simon, your hand was still raised, but I guess it was not a question. Okay. We have time for at least one extra question, depending on the length of the question and of the answer. I have questions, of course, but I'm happy to let others ask questions. It's easier for me to, or than for most of you probably, to discuss with Antoine afterwards. Okay, so I will ask one of my questions, and we'll see if any other question emerges. So yeah, there's one point, Antoine, in the analysis when you mention the difference between the extension and the intention of the concept. And when you mention the intention of the concept of pathology or of health, you immediately mention the goal of the concept. Intention in this context usually means meaning, actually, of the term. So how do you relate or connect the meaning with the goal of? Because to me it's two different problems. I find that interesting, and I'm interested more in the goal of the concept than in the meaning of the concept, because I think that the meaning should be subordinated to the goal we try to achieve. So could you just explain a little bit more why you so quickly move from one to the other?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my interpretation of the philosophical explication approach is because I read the papers by Schwartz, and I asked myself, okay, well, so the first thing to do is to identify roles for the concepts of health and pathology. And as far as I remember, he says little about how we identify those goals more particularly. And so I try to think of myself in the process of trying to identify goals for the concepts of health and pathology. And I sort of found out that I was just, again, brought back to intuitions, but not intuitions about particular cases, but intuitions about what the concepts should do. And it seems to me that in a situation where we have concepts that are debated because it's uncertain what their meanings are, then the most direct grasp we have of the meaning of the concepts are the roles that we think the concept should do. Or at least if the roles are clearer to us than what the definition, the meaning of the concept should be, then we can appeal to the roles to provide something about the meaning of the concepts. So that's why I linked roles to the intention of the concept, but maybe I should have been more careful to make sure not giving the impression that I thought the meaning and the roles of the concepts were the exact same thing. I don't think they're the same thing. I just think that there's a strong connection between the meaning of concepts and the goal for which we use them. Or at least that's that's my reading of how to manage the project of elaborating philosophical definitions, explications.
Okay, so I didn't think actually that when I heard that you were mixing meaning and goal, but rather that you were just, you know, not explaining how you moved from one to the other. That was all. Okay, so we are almost at the end of the session. So maybe there's a last question to be asked and a short answer. We have just 1 minute. So that would be okay. If not, then I think it's time to thank Antoine for this talk and of course also the audience for coming and attending.
Thanks a lot for everyone for listening to me and also for the great discussions. I'm going back, if we can speak this way, I'm going back home with a lot of things to think about and concerns that I have to tackle to improve my proposal. So thanks a lot for the discussion.
Well, thank you for the talk in the first place. Thomas, do you want to say something before, maybe about the next?
So so first, thank you, Antoine. And the next seminar will be on December, I forgot exactly, but very soon. Maybe. So sorry, but yeah, December 15th, I was not entirely sure. So Jim Tabery, personalized medicine wasn't personal, precision medicine isn't precise. That December 15th. 6 p.m. French time. Yeah, it was better to check. So thank you very much, Antoine, and we will be happy to see as many people as today on December 15th.
Thank you all. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks again. Bye-bye. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Thanks, Antoine.